Okay, hello everyone and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture. We'll be talking about archives and social justice, a call to arms, ? Here are weekly topics and course objectives for this week. What is archival activism? How does social justice relate to archival activism? Should archives be involved in social justice issues? And what role can archives play in promoting social justice? As you can see here, we'll be looking at all 5 of our course learning objectives for this course. So defining core concepts, looking at the role the records creators play in the construction of social memory, looking at some ways in which aspects of archival practice connect and relate to each other through the lens of social justice, of course. I described the social responsibilities and ethical obligations of archivists and looking at some of the factors that have influenced the evolution of the archival profession. So we'll start by looking at some definitions and descriptions of social justice from a couple of our readings for this week. So this first excerpt from the Duff, etc. Reading for this week describes some different characteristics of social justice and some of the standards that are tied into social justice, such as freedom, equality, and respect, and the need to identify violations of standards and to confront violations of standards. Specifically, Duff talks about drawing attention to inequalities of power, looking at how these inequalities manifest in institutional arrangements, how they manifest in systemic inequities, and in inequities that further the interests of some groups at the expense of others. Kind of pessimistically, Duff and her co-authors state that social justice is always a process and can never be fully achieved. But we'll talk about some of the ways in which archives might be able to at least promote social justice today. Next, we have a couple of excerpts from the Wallace Currents chapter. One interesting thing that Wallace notes here is that social justice may be thwarted by unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols and institutional rules. Just kind of everyday processes where oppressions are systematically reproduced, and they're not really acknowledged and confronted, as Duff contends is necessary for social justice to be supported. And we'll talk about how archives have been institutions that have contributed to or worked against social justice by not really thinking about how they operate or why they operate the way that they do, or what kind of habits have been ingrained into archival traditions and processes throughout the year, what kind of institutional rules that archives have engaged in might work against social justice. And a couple of things that social justice is also related to is the ability of a person to develop and exercise one's capabilities and expressing one's experiences. And archives are certainly institutions that can either support that happening or can prevent that from happening. And then there's this additional part about participating one's actions and the conditions of one's actions. And we'll talk about participation in archives in just a little bit as well. So just some different characteristics of social justice. And as I mentioned, a few of these things we'll be touching on off and on throughout this lecture. To talk a little bit more about social justice and what social justice is related to, here is a list of some things that social justice strives towards and strives against from the Duff et al. Reading for this week. So social justice strives towards full human recognition, a fair and just redistribution of power or distribution of power, full and equal participation in things like political processes, decision making, education, employment, and so on. And social justice strives towards an acknowledgement and remedy of historical inequalities with specific measures. So one of the things that Duff mentions is reparations, which is of course related to the Robinson Sweet article that we looked at for this week. Some things that social justice strives against is dominance and systemic inequalities, and disrespect, marginalization, exclusion, and non-recognition. And in a lot of ways, archives have been pretty potent factors in or supporters of some of these things traditionally, especially marginalization, exclusion, and non-recognition. These are three things that archives, unfortunately, have contributed to over the years, and we'll talk about how and why in just a little bit. So some points of contact between archives and social justice. This is from the Wallace article, chapter on page 279. Contestations over the nature and direction of society, construction and reconstruction of the past, and the relationship between record keeping, record making, and archiving to social justice and injustice. So anytime an institution is involved in the construction or reconstruction of the past, the possibility exists for that institution to develop or support particular narratives that may empower one group of society and disempower or marginalize another group of society. And that can have an obvious impact on social justice. So the role that archives have had in constructing and reconstructing the past has impacted social justice within society as a whole. Contestations over the nature and direction of society. If archives support one viewpoint related to the nature and direction of society and support one sort of one argument within this contestation over the nature and direction of society, then that can disenfranchise and marginalize people who feel like the nature and direction of society is actually quite different and may lead to a particular perspective over the nature and direction of society being excluded from social history and from a broader social discussion. So to look more specifically at how archives contribute to social injustice, they do so by having control over knowledge, by shaping what society knows, and by embracing neutrality as a possibility. So this last one is a pretty potent way in which archives can contribute to social injustice. History is not neutral, and the records that come into archives are not neutral. They're biased, they're partial, they support a particular perspective, and oftentimes, as we'll talk about in just a minute, that's the perspective of the people that are in power at a given moment. And if archives say, oh, well, we're neutral, we couldn't possibly throw our weight to support one perspective or one experience over another, then they're not being neutral. They are actually taking active steps through this inaction to support the narrative of those in power. And as Wallace notes, a lack of interrogation by archives over what they do and how they do it, the norms and traditions that archives have embraced, have led to archives that in many instances exclude and marginalize individuals and communities from archives and the historical record. So by saying we're neutral and we're just going to accept neutrality as a defining component of archives, that sets up the condition where archives are marginalizing and excluding people from being represented in archives. And this can be a very disempowering act. If your community and your history is not represented in archives, then that can result in your community not being seen as legitimate or important. And if something isn't legitimate or important, then why would you care what happens to it, right? Archives can contribute to social injustice by controlling knowledge and presenting a perspective of a community or of an organization or of an event that may not be holistic, may not incorporate the memories and perspectives of a representative sample of society. And again, this can lead to particular perspectives and particular viewpoints being present in archives and present in society, and other perspectives and viewpoints being excluded and left out of society and left out of social memory. So archives certainly aren't all powerful. There are definitely other forms of media out there, but the role that archives have in controlling knowledge and shaping what society knows is magnified somewhat by the authenticity that archives provide. So people may feel that archives are objective, contain only facts, that they contain information that has been evaluated and judged by people with a particular knowledge and expertise. And that gives the records that are in archives a certain cachet, a certain power that records found outside of archival care may not have. And so if archives control knowledge and shape what society knows in a way that does support one perspective over another and does empower one group of people over another, that may not be something that is necessarily questioned by the general public. They may not understand that what archives have is just one piece of the puzzle, and then there may be other perspectives and other records outside of archives that exist, but simply aren't as accessible and haven't been legitimized to the extent that records and archives have. So they may rely on the archives to develop and communicate an authentic and representative truth, when in fact what archives do contain, because of the choices that they've made over the years that have marginalized and excluded people from archives, is in fact a very warped and incomplete and limited perspective about society and about different aspects of society. And obviously, the representation of events in archives that is most likely going to be warped and inaccurate and only supports the perspective of one people can have a strong role in the disenfranchisement and marginalization that we have discussed in this lecture, and that can certainly thwart attempts by members of a community or activists in and out of a community to achieve the redistribution of power and the equal access to resources that are important components of social justice. On page 32 in the Robinson Sweet article, the author talks about how archives exist and operate in some ways within a cycle. So people in power create a context in which that defines what records will be brought into an archive, which records are thought of as being important enough to be included in archives, and that defines the archive. That dictates the types of records that will be found in archives and also the types of records that will not be found in archives. And because people in power are creating this context that defines archives, that may result in archives that support the powerful. Because if you're in power, you're not going to develop archives that include or make accessible perspectives or viewpoints that are against your interests. Perspectives or viewpoints that are against your interests may undermine your power. It may lead you to lose power. And that's not usually something that people in power want to see happen. And so as archives support the powerful and they work against social justice or work against efforts to redistribute power, that just gives people that are in power more of an ability to create the context that determines how archives are defined and what is included in archives. And it can just become kind of a cycle, as I have noted here, that just becomes ingrained in how archives are created, how archives are operated, what perspectives archives provide access to, what perspectives archives highlight. And this cycle can serve as a mechanism to, at the very least, continue the marginalization and disenfranchisement of people, and may lead to members of society becoming more powerful and not only continuing to marginalize and disenfranchise people that have already been marginalized and disenfranchised, but perhaps as they grow powerful, marginalizing and disenfranchising even more people. So the role that archives play in cementing and supporting the power of the powerful individuals of society really contributes to, can contribute to social injustice. And obviously this works against some of the goals of social justice that we talked about earlier on in this lecture. So what can archives do in order to kind of break out of this cycle and operate in a way that does support social justice and does support the redistribution of power, does support the ability of individuals to recount and express their experiences and their perspectives what can archives do to truly become agents of change in society? Tough chapter for this week has some ideas about that. So first of all, just recognizing that there is a problem, that there are inequalities in society, that individuals, groups, organizations, and communities are excluded from important decisions and processes affecting them and their safety. So you have to admit that there's a problem, right? That's kind of the first step in any rehabilitation. Next, archives can employ intellectual and physical resources to challenge and change these structures, to really work against the exclusion, marginalization, and domination found in society. And next, archives can recognize contestations over record making, including what gets recorded and how it gets recorded, and record keeping, including how records and other information objects are managed, selected, controlled, accessed, and preserved. Archives can also proactively enable participation in and access to the archive. They can be mindful of the exclusions, absences, and silences in archives and consider how these gaps can be remedied. They can understand how archives can facilitate restorative, reparative, transitional justice through protection, supplementation to, and promotion of the record. And they can resist exclusions and marginalizations from archival institutions. So again, it starts with a basic recognition that there is inequality in society. And once archives are able to do that, they're able to think about ways in which they can challenge and right some of these inequalities. So how they can work against marginalization, exclusion, and domination. And this goes back to acknowledging some of the pretty basic aspects of archiving. So recognizing how records are being made, thinking about record keeping decisions, including ones that archives engage in. And then taking specific actions to remedy some of the exclusion, marginalization, and domination that they see. So if we think about recognizing these systemic inequalities, using these physical resources, recognizing contestations, and then I'm really going to focus on these last four and connect them to some of the different archival processes that we have discussed in this class already, and talk about how these processes can contribute to some of these actions that archives can take in order to be more supportive of social justice issues. So let's look at some of the actions that archives can take that can support social justice, and talk about how some of our archival processes relate to them. So looking at how archives can proactively enable participation in and access to the archive. So if you look at arrangement and description, something that archives can do is they can include individuals or community members from outside the archive into decisions about how records are arranged and described. So work with community members to determine how their community is represented within archives. Archives can work to provide open access to records, especially by the community members and individuals represented within them. And by doing so, reconnect them with their past, with their history. Outreach is a big thing. If people don't know that an archive exists, then they may not think to access the archives or think to use the archives. Looking at community archives are an essential part of community archives is community participation surrounding record keeping decisions related to records. And this is something that we'll talk more about next week. But community archives can be archives that are very centered around the idea of community participation and using community participation to correct false or missing representations about a community in history and in society. So participation is a very strong aspect of community archiving. Looking at mindfulness of exclusions, absences, and silences in the archive, and thinking about how these gaps can be remedied. If you look at appraisal, thinking of which voices are absent within your archive and making appraisal choices that attempt to mend these exclusions and work against these absences and silences in your archives. So if you are an archive located in a community that has a very rich and diverse history, but your archive only has the perspective of one group within that area, then it really behooves you to try and include records that document other voices in your archive. And that can certainly be done through appraisal. Again, looking at arrangement and description, if your records are described in a way that excludes certain people from a finite, or perhaps records of a particular group aren't described as thoroughly or carefully, then you may go back and revise your description so that certain portions of your collections are highlighted that maybe weren't highlighted before. Looking at personal archives, oftentimes the personal perspective is seen as less valuable or less evidentiary as organizational perspectives, and oftentimes the organizational perspectives that survive are slanted in a particular way, and that particular way may support the perspective of the powerful in society. So perhaps the way that your archives can work against exclusions and absences and silences is by valuing personal archives equally and elevating the voices found in personal archives the same way that you would the voices found in organizational archives, and really valuing both organizational and personal archives as important and valuable perspectives on what's going on in society at a given moment. Looking at our The last one I've listed here, understanding how archives can facilitate restorative, reparative, transitional justice through protection, supplementation to, and promotion of the record. Obviously, when you look at promotion of the record, outreach is a big thing, and making sure that people are aware of records, they're aware of the restorative and reparative role that records can have. Looking at appraisal, if records are brought into archival custody, oftentimes that can support their long-term protection because at least ideally they're going to be in a climate where the records are protected, where they are given expert preservation care, and that is something that is going to make the information contained within the records survive and be accessible to more people for a longer period of time. Supplementation to the record, again, looking at arrangement and description, encouraging people to provide their perspective about a collection or about records, maybe through things like annotations to a finding aid or some other participatory tool. Promotion of the record, again, through researcher services, highlighting collections for researchers that are related to disenfranchised communities and making sure that researchers are aware that those records exist and that they may be valuable for research. So the long and short of this is that most processes that archives engage in, really every process that archives engage in, can be used to support social justice and can be used to support the different actions that Duff and her co-authors encourage archives to do in order to support social justice. And again, it just really goes back to acknowledging that social injustice exists and thinking about ways in which archives can work against that, again, by thinking about what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and how they can take processes that they're engaging in and make them more supportive of social justice goals. All these different processes can support the idea of reparations, which is something that the Robinson Suite article discusses quite a bit. So the Robinson Suite article describes reparations as measures to satisfy victims, such as revealing the truth, holding perpetrators accountable, and ceasing ongoing violations in cases of massive systemic rights violations. These measures can take many forms, including symbolic gestures such as an official apology or the erection of a monument, legal actions such as the restoration of rights or exonerations of a conviction, or material compensation such as direct payments to victims or their descendants, restoration of property, or demands or payments to funds or assistance programs. And the Robinson Suite article does a good job of describing some ways in which archives have contributed to these different actions taking place. And the Robinson Suite article really advocates for archives being activated in a way that is in service of reparations, that does strive towards some of the restorative and reparative actions that that the definition of reparations that I just read describes. So archives can contribute to social justice by, instead of only having the powerful create context, finding ways in which the disenfranchised can create context by participating in archives, by being included in record-keeping decisions surrounding records that are in archival care. And these decisions can define the archives. These decisions can define how records within archival care are thought of. These decisions can define the perspectives that that archives support. And through this definition of archives, archives can support the disenfranchised and can support social justice issues. And as before, it can create a cycle where, as archives support the disenfranchised, that gives people who have been disenfranchised more power to create the context that's found in archives, and it can become a cycle that can support some of the social justice goals and concerns that we have talked about in this lecture. But again, the main thing here is, rather than the powerful creating the context which dictates what archives are and what's contained in archives, it's people that have been historically disenfranchised and excluded and marginalized and dominated. And again, for this to happen, archives really need to be cognizant of what they do, why they do it, how they do it, and as we just discussed, ways in which the processes that archives carry out can be tweaked to be more supportive of social justice goals. One thing that I do want to make a connection with is personal archives and social justice. Personal archives can be a very important part of the social justice efforts that archives engage in. As we talked about last time, oftentimes personal archives can serve as a counterweight for the perspective and viewpoints of organizations. And this is important because if organizations have carried out actions that work against social justice, then personal archives might be the only source of information that can document those kinds of transgressions. So as I've noted here, they can provide evidence for activities carried out by governments and corporations for which records are not available. Another thing that I want to highlight is something that we also talked about during our discussion of personal archives, and that's the idea of personal archives involving the participation by people represented in records in appraisal, description, and access choices made about records created by governments and corporations. So if you think about it, in a situation where people represented within records have no control over how those records are used, who uses them, which records are thought of as being important, how records are arranged and described, that's a very disempowering relationship. It's one in which organizations and organizational archives have the only say in how records are appraised, how they're arranged and described, and so on. This more social justice centered perspective of personal archives, in which people represented within records have some power to participate in these record keeping decisions, is one that is definitely more in line with some of the goals of social justice which include the redistribution of power, the redistribution of access to resources, and the discontinuation of marginalization and domination. One important thing to note is that personal archives, and especially personal archives that may document social justice issues, for archives to acquire those records, it's important that the people who create and maintain personal archives trust archives. If I have records that detail how I was marginalized, or how my family was marginalized, or if I have personal archives that contain evidence that document something that a powerful organization has done to my community or to society, I'm probably going to be pretty reluctant to give those up or to make those more publicly available unless I trust that the institution that is going to be doing this is going to work in my best interests, or is at least going to be fair in how they maintain those records, how they take care of those records, and so on. So it all goes back to a few things that we've talked about in this class, namely the need for archives to be able to demonstrate what they do, why they should be trusted, for archives to behave in a ethical and transparent manner, and the need for archives to promote who they are and why they exist and what they do. So again, the importance of building trust and archival outreach. So of course, personal archives are not neutral and impartial, and it really is up to the researcher to determine what is true and what isn't true. And this is especially important in instances where social justice violations have taken place. But that doesn't mean that they don't serve as sources of evidence and that they aren't really valuable tools in supporting social justice. So they shouldn't be disregarded as tools in the fight for social justice just because they may be subjective and they may communicate or support a certain perspective. One factor influencing whether or not archives participate in social justice issues or how they participate in social justice issues is the mission of the archives. As Green contends in his reading for this week, that social justice in archives should be limited by the archives mission statement. And that's sort of the end all and the be all. If the archives mission statement incorporates social justice as one of the priorities and possibilities within the institution, then pursuing social justice is perfectly fine. If not, then archives should not engage in social justice efforts. However, I don't think that this statement is necessarily as limiting as it may seem at first blush. And that archives and their mission statements may leave plenty of space to support reparation efforts and social justice efforts even without explicitly doing so. The flexibility really depends on the nature of the archives and the archive's stakeholders. So for a corporate archive, there may be very little room for in archives to support social justice issues. It may be beyond the scope of the archive, and maybe beyond the interests of a particular corporation who may just want a corporate archives that preserves and provides access to and highlights the company's history. And that may be the beginning and the end of it. With governmental archives, there may be a little bit more flexibility. Governmental archives are often controlled by people that are in power. And social justice efforts that we talked about before oftentimes seek to redistribute that power or recalibrate that power in a more equal manner, which is something that people in power are typically not big fans of. But there still may be aspects of governmental archives that at least nominally can support social justice issues. So the governmental archive may contain evidence of social injustices that either the government itself or other governments have committed. The governmental archives may feel like it's in their best interests to provide access to and highlight some materials in their collection that could be used for social justice purposes. Perhaps they feel that providing access to this information won't damage their interest in the long run. So they say, okay, well, why not just provide this information? And it's not something that we really need to worry about too much. So there may be a little bit more flexibility for governmental archives to have some connection to social justice efforts. With academic archives, there may be a little bit more flexibility even still. Universities, at least superficially, claim to be institutions that support diversity and support the empowerment of different community members, institutions that seek to provide a pluralistic perspective on society, and that certainly leaves some room for connections to social justice, probably at least to the extent that social justice efforts don't challenge the power of people that run a university or a university system. And then we have community archives, which, from my perspective, exist in most instances as organizations that are created and developed in order to fight for social justice. They are organizations in archives that are created because a particular community feels like their community is in danger. They feel like their perspective is not being heard in society. They feel like their history has been excluded or misrepresented in society. And so they develop community archives as a way to take back the power to represent themselves and to participate in the creation of their own history, as opposed to having their history created for them. So there's obviously a lot of overlap between this and social justice. So it's just interesting to look at a mission statement for one academic archive. And we'll look at the mission statement for the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center. As soon as I scroll through this link here, yep, here we go. Okay. So here's the mission statement for the American Heritage Center, the archive for the University of Wyoming. And in a lot of ways, it's pretty general. So maintaining the university's archives, collecting, preserving, and disseminating the historical documentation of select aspects of cultural heritage at the local, state, national, and even international levels, supporting administrative and educational curriculum at the university, enabling historical research and interpretation across a broad spectrum of interests and disciplines, and then some of the different services that the AHC provides. So in a lot of ways, this mission statement covers some pretty typical bases for archives. So, here's what we exist to do. And you, at first blush, you might not see a lot of connection between this mission and social justice. But if you dig a little bit further, I think that you can make some connections. So select aspects of cultural heritage. That's pretty vague. It could include things like cultural heritage that is tied to a particular community or a particular community member that that has been disenfranchised or marginalized in history. The educational curriculum at the university may include classes that have some connection to social justice. And so the American Heritage Center could say, all right, well, we want to collect these records from this community because it supports this class about African American history in Wyoming, or this class is related to Indigenous American communities in Wyoming. And that can open the door for a lot of appraisal decisions, which do involve the incorporation of different perspectives into the collections of the American Heritage Center. When people think of social justice, they tend to think of things like marching and waving signs, and I think the Green article talks about abolishing private property, which seems pretty extreme, but it doesn't really have to be that that sort of stereotypically activist. It can be as simple as collecting the records of a community that hasn't had its records in an archive before. It can be as simple as developing an exhibit related to the experiences of a particular community. So the Robinson Sweet article talks about an exhibit related to the internment of Japanese Americans and how that supported their desire to receive reparations for their experience and the experience of their loved ones. So archives don't have to march in the streets and wave signs in order to be, as Robinson Sweet argues, archivists should be activists for the public's right to access the past. It can be as simple as just thinking about which collections you are collecting and which collections you aren't collecting, and trying to be aware of silences in your archive, and keeping that in mind when you're thinking about acquiring a particular set of records, or keeping that in mind when you're thinking about what records you might want to highlight in an exhibit or on social media. And I feel like there is a lot of room within the framework of archival mission statements for that type of activity to take place. So again, I don't think that Green's sort of limitations about social justice in archives are necessarily as constrictive as they might seem when he states them, and that there can be a lot of flexibility for archives and archival interaction with social justice issues. A lot of mission statements are pretty vague, so you can kind of sneak in a lot of stuff and say, well, you know, this is a part of our mission, and that's why I feel that this is an appropriate thing for our archive to do. So I see social justice activity in archives as falling into a few different stages. So it could be stage one, where an archive is actively collecting records related to social justice, among other types of records. It's not necessarily something that they go out and seek, but you know, it's something that may happen kind of inadvertently. Then we have stage two, which is where archives are engaged in promoting or increasing access to social justice records held in an archive. So again, perhaps by doing an exhibit related to records that document a social injustice that a community has endured, or records that elevate the voice of people that have been disenfranchised in the past. Next, we have stage three, where an archive might be actively collecting only records related to social justice. So they're only interested in records that, that document the voices and perspectives of marginalized communities. And beyond that, they're not really interested in collecting anything else. So this would be more of a community archive situation. And then finally, in stage four, an archive that uses collected and or created records to pursue social justice goals. So this would be something that the interference archive from the article that we read for this week talks about. So not only collecting records, but actively creating records and using these records in direct activities or direct activism to pursue social justice goals. So using archival records to make signs, and using those signs for what is considered more stereotypically activist purposes. So again, the stage that archives engage in is really going to depend on its mission. It's going to depend on the comfort of the archivists that work within an archive. It's going to depend on the interests of the people who pay for the different processes that the archive engages in. You know, if you are a corporate archive, then you can certainly run the risk of ruffling a lot of feathers if you're engaging in efforts that can be seen as more socially justice oriented. So you have to take that into consideration. If your stakeholders are community members that have experienced social injustice in the past, then your archive may be able to operate more in stage 3 or stage 4 without causing any concern by the people that are supporting you. So it just depends on the context of your archive, and again, the willingness of your archives and the archivists that work there to be introspective about what they do, introspective about why they do it, and thoughtful about how the everyday norms and traditions and habits of archives have contributed to social injustice in the past, and how those norms, traditions, and habits can be challenged and modernized in ways that can support social justice in the future. So we'll go ahead and close there. Archival involvement in social justice is kind of a newer topic. It's one that necessarily wasn't as discussed or acted upon in the past, but it is something that can engage the public and can really make the public aware of the types of records that archives have, the different processes that archives engage in, the value that archives can bring to society, and that can certainly be a good thing. There's a danger that it can be a negative thing if it causes people to lose support for archives, if they feel like archives are being overly political. And that's something else that archives have to keep into consideration. So it really just goes back to knowing what your mission is, knowing who your stakeholders are, and adjusting your efforts within that particular context. Again, some of the things that we talked about as far as proactively enabling participation, being mindful of absences and silences in the archives, a lot of these are things that are pretty broadly supportable and things that are pretty easy sells to stakeholders with a little bit of massaging and a little bit of some creative communication. So again, archivists waving signs in the streets is one thing, but archives facilitating access to historical materials, that's something that is much more broadly understood and accepted as a part of what archives do in a normal day. So it can really go back to just how you're representing your social justice issues and how people understand what you're doing and how that communicates to the role of archives in society. But archives can have an important role in supporting social justice and promoting the redistribution of power and promoting the ability of people who have been disenfranchised in the past to represent themselves and have power over how they are represented instead of being powerless. And so it really is important for archives to think about how they can lead to a more diverse representation of society and how they can support the ability of people to contribute to that diverse representation on their own terms instead of having those terms dictated to them by archivists or other powerful people in society. So we'll stop there. As always, please let me know if you have any questions and stay safe.